Well, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Gerrymandering the States Public Policy and Social Consequences webinar, which is being sponsored by CHARGE. If you don't know, that stands for the Coalition Hub Advancing Redistricting and Grassroots Engagement. It's also sponsored by State Voices, the League of Women Voters, and Fair Count. I'm Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, and I'm the Vice President at Fair Count. We have an exciting panel for you today featuring authors of the recently released book, Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism, and special guests from the Union of Concerned Scientists. If you're joining us today, you probably know a little bit about redistricting and why it's so important, but today we're going to take it a step further. Today, we're going to discuss how unfair redistricting maps can impact public health outcomes, public policy, voting rights, and our very democracy. And we will, of course, let you know how you can help fight for fair maps in your community. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alex Kenna, who will provide information that will help set the stage for the panel discussion. Dr. Kenna is a political science professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he studies political representation and elections. He's also written several articles and books on redistricting. And so now I am going to turn it over to Alex. Welcome.
Hi, and thank you so much for the introduction, Janine. I'm going to share my screen here and apologize. I have a gazillion things open on my computer. So take me one moment. All right, let's do this full screen. So here's a map that is actually created by Professor Justin Levitt at Loyola Law School, a website that he maintains called All About Redistricting, that shows you the political control of redistricting of Congress in the current redistricting cycle. And so what we see is probably no surprise. Everybody here probably knows that the Republicans have a numerical advantage when it comes to controlling redistricting. And much of their advantage is clustered in the South and across the Midwest. This is at the congressional level. It's pretty much the same at the state legislative level. On the previous map, there are a lot of states that have one district, and obviously you don't need to redistrict one district. But when we look at the state legislative level, it's the same thing. Another thing that's striking is a number of states that Democrats control, which is really only a couple. And what I want to talk about a little bit is why political control matters and what we might expect that to lead to. When we looked at the last redistricting cycle, one of the things we saw is that there was severe political gerrymandering when one party controlled the redistricting process without the input of another party. This is something we reported in our 2016 book, Gerrymandering in America. We saw that across the country, the congressional maps were more or less tilted in favor of one party. It happened to be the Republicans, such that the Democrats would need to win about 9 points more than the Republicans would nationwide to have a 50-50 shot at winning the House of Representatives. So in our most recent book, we looked at state legislative redistricting to sort of estimate the scope of gerrymandering in the state legislative maps. We looked at 95 state legislative maps that were drawn during the 2011 redistricting cycle and observed the change before and after. And one of the things that we found was that of the 95 maps in our sample, 45 were drawn with extreme partisan gerrymandering. Now, we measured extreme partisan gerrymandering by looking at the elections that occurred before 2011 and after 2011. In many states, we looked at multiple elections, and we were able to determine the advantage that one party had in a state over another. And if the bias was 10% or more, we considered it extreme, which meant that one party would get 10% more seats than the other party would for a similar share of the vote. And so almost half of the state legislative maps that we observed had evidence of this extreme gerrymandering. And by the way, 43 of these maps favor the Republicans, and 2 of those maps favor the Democrats. So what exactly causes gerrymandering? In recent years, there's been a lot of discussion and debate, some heated debate, especially among political scientists, because we get really heated about things that probably most people would find pretty boring. But there's been a heated debate about the role of geography and the fact that Democrats live in cities and whether and the extent to which this actually causes gerrymandering. But it's pretty clear that at the end of the day, it's all about politics. So here's a graph that I've taken out of our recently published book that shows you the change in partisan symmetry, which is how we measure gerrymandering, before redistricting and after redistricting in those 95 state legislative maps. And what it shows is that the negative numbers show evidence of extreme Republican gerrymandering, and the positive numbers show evidence of extreme Democratic gerrymandering. And on the x-axis here, this is the old maps, and on the y-axis, these are the revised maps. And what we see is that politics matters in pretty fundamental ways. Let me show you. If you look at the bottom right quadrant here, these are when an independent, non-partisan commission or a court drew the lines in 2011. And what we see is that most of the maps are sort of clustered around this line, this dashed line, which represents no change in terms of gerrymandering. However, there is a tendency for the maps to reduce the level of bias. And so one of the things we found in our analysis is that when non-political actors draw the lines, they tend to reduce the level of bias, but there is somewhat of a bias towards the status quo. When you look at both political parties and maps that were drawn by both Republicans and Democrats, we see this very, very close clustering to that line, which meant the political parties essentially agreed not to change much in the maps at all. They sort of agreed on stalemate, let's maintain the status quo. But when one party controlled the lines, let's look at Republicans here, what we see is that the new maps that are created became overall more biased. There is no connection to that dashed line whatsoever. It was essentially using the control of redistricting to increase the gerrymandering in favor to the Republicans. And we see something similar in the Democratic maps, although the Democrats aren't able to create bias. The best they can do in many states, like Illinois, for example, is just eliminate any pro-Republican bias so that they get a neutral map. And so there's a lot of reason to believe that politics is pretty fundamental here. But it's also important to grasp the role of political geography, how people and how they're spatially distributed across the space, across the state matters as well. One of the things that we've seen in our analysis is a very close connection between racial segregation and political geography. So this is a map of Virginia. This is where I live. In Virginia, we had a lot of issues with racial gerrymandering. It created many, many disruptions, both to the congressional map and to the state legislative map. This graph shows you the racial distribution of voters in Virginia. And if you look at the dark blue, almost black squares, those are counties that are overwhelmingly white. And if you look at the little squares that are more lavender, those are areas that have large African-American populations. And in general, there's the clustering of African-American citizens around central and southern and eastern Virginia. These are also the population areas. Here in Northern Virginia is a population area, Central Virginia, and the Tidewater region over here. And so this is where most of the diversity is in the state and where most of the population is in the state. And that causes problems for Democrats, but it creates opportunities for Republicans. For Democrats, it means that it's really hard to draw a gerrymander in a place like Virginia because you have a lot of constituencies that tend to vote Democratic that are tightly clustered in space. And so it becomes very hard for Democrats to draw gerrymanders. They have to resort to drawing really irregular shapes that sort of rope urban clusters in with white suburban areas to kind of to waste the vote of Republicans. It's very difficult. On the other hand, for Republicans, it's actually really, really easy to gerrymander in a state like Virginia, because what you do is you look for communities of color and you draw very tight, compact districts around communities of color. And that's precisely what they did. In 2012, this is what the map looked like right after redistricting. This was an election, a congressional election that was pretty close between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, it was close to 50-50. I think the Republicans had a small edge. And out of 11 of Virginia's congressional districts, 8 went to Republicans and 3 went to Democrats. And as you'll see, this is darker shades show more one-sided returns in a congressional district. You see this, I believe to be District 3 here in Virginia, which is a majority minority district, overwhelmingly tilting towards the Democratic Party. And here in Northern Virginia, you have some reliably blue districts as well. But around this majority minority district, you have some very light shading. These were much more competitive districts that still were relatively safe for Republicans. Well, this district in particular was invalidated by a federal court just before the 2016 elections for unconstitutional racial vote dilution, and it was redrawn in advance of the 2018 election. Now, the 2018 election, the Democrats did a little bit better, but because the districts were redrawn, it gave the Democrats an opportunity to take 6 out of the state's 11 districts. So this is an example of how the Republicans actually gerrymander, is at least in the South, when you have racial segregation, you have an extent of racial segregation in Virginia. It's simply a matter of targeting minority communities and drawing district lines around minority communities so that you achieve political advantage by diluting the vote of minority voters. So we decided to look at all of this nationwide, and we looked at the relationship between racial segregation at the state level and the level of gerrymandering in the map. And what we found was pretty interesting. We found that when the maps were drawn by Democrats, members of both parties, or a non-political actor like a judge, there was essentially no relationship between racial segregation and bias. So the argument that having large racially segregated populations is bad for Democrats is simply not true. However, when we looked at Republicans, we isolated the sample of only Republican drawn maps. We saw a pretty clear relationship between racial segregation and gerrymandering. So the short story here is that Republicans end up gerrymandering effectively by simply targeting racial segregation. And it's pretty clear that when Republicans are in charge, you see a very strong correlation between gerrymandering and racial segregation. So in states that are more racially segregated, we tend to see more gerrymandering. And to us, this is pretty compelling evidence that across the country, map makers, particularly those who are Republicans, are targeting communities of color and historically marginalized communities in order to achieve a political advantage. So I'm going to conclude my presentation here and hand it over to Janine.
Thank you so much for that informative presentation. You know, a lot of times I think we hear a lot of anecdotes, but it's one thing to actually put data behind some of the issues that we've seen in certain communities. And so I really appreciate you presenting those data. Now that we're all informed, I am going to turn it over to our moderator, the incomparable Lada Knott, who is the Deputy Director of Policy at State Voices. So, and Lada is going to moderate our panel. So kicking it over to you, Lada.
Thanks, Janine. And thank you so much, Alex, for that level setting. As Janine said, I have the privilege of moderating today's panel discussion, and we are lucky to have all 4 authors of Gerrymandering the States with us today. You already know Alex, but let me introduce you to the other 3. We've got Dr. Michael Latner, who is a professor of political science and public policy at California Polytechnic State University and senior fellow with the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We have Dr. Anthony McCann, professor of government and public policy at the University of Strathclyde. And we have Dr. Charles Anthony Smith, listed as Tony Smith here, professor of political science and law at the University of California, Irvine. We also have a special guest from the Union of Concerned Scientists joining us, and that is Dr. Sofia Marjanovic. She is a bilingual senior organizer at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She has a doctorate in immunology and microbiology and is a seasoned activist and community organizer. And thank you all so much for joining us. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A box because we will have some time for Q&A in a little bit. And panelists, all of my questions are open to all of you. And of course, more than one person can chime in on any particular question. So to start with, from Alex's presentation, we learned a lot about partisan gerrymandering, and people often view it in an abstract kind of way, like it's just a game that political parties play. So what's striking about your work is the way that it lays out the actual practical real world effects of partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So again, open to everybody. Can you tell me about how gerrymandering can have an impact on health?
Mike, why don't you take that one first?
Yeah, sure. That's something that we can speak to directly. We have some graphics, and we will discuss that. I think the key thing to keep in mind here, to Lada's point, is we often think of gerrymandering purely in the electoral context and in the context of party competition. There hasn't been a lot of research exploring the policy consequences of gerrymandering, and that's something that we're definitely going to touch on today, because in fact, what matters is, I think Alex's presentation makes perfectly clear, this is not a question of simply geography or the distribution of partisanship. This is political, and it's also important to note that we're not just harping on Republicans here, right? I mean, the whole point of this sort of research is to demonstrate that when parties are going to party, and parties have incentives, they have they have policy agendas, and they're going to use whatever electoral rules are at their disposal to maximize their advantage. And that's really what we're demonstrating here, is that the Democratic Party does not have as many opportunities. But when you have one party in control of the process, and you've got this incentive, when there's no judicial restraint, and the electoral rules are now also being made by those same partisan legislatures, there are going to be serious policy consequences, including consequences for health outcomes, which, as it so happens, as we were finishing up this book, we had a sort of horrific natural experiment with a global pandemic. And so we're able to actually look at the responses of state legislatures by their level of gerrymandering and how biased the legislatures are, and we see some pretty pronounced effects.
Do you want me to put on your slides?
Sure.
I'm going to share these slides here.
Yeah, so this is a question that the Union of Concerned Scientists was really interested in, looking at the health and environmental outcomes of electoral bias, and this is it's a complicated scientific question, right? So health outcomes are a consequence of millions of factors. And so when we look at a chart like this is a comparison of 3 different racial categories using census data, and we're dividing up these populations within state legislatures that are either under Democratic control, divided control, GOP control that doesn't meet our definition of an extreme gerrymander, and then those state legislatures that are biased more than 10%, which we refer to as extreme GOP gerrymanders. And the first thing you see when we're just looking at a very well-known health metric like infant mortality, right? These are infant deaths per 1,000 births. And the thing that pops out immediately is that in Black communities, they suffer much higher rates of infant mortality, right? And that's across the board, regardless of which party controls the state legislature. And this just, reinforces the point that health outcomes are very complicated and not directly tied to politics. But what we do find is that when we look at who controls the state legislatures in the political process, we do see that there is a relationship. It's much noisier among Hispanic communities, as you can see, in part because, frankly, the census designation of Hispanic includes a very wide, diverse array of communities. But I think the comparison here between white non-Hispanic and black non-Hispanic states really demonstrates that there are inequities and there are real and statistically significant disparities in infant mortality, in life expectancy, and a number of other related outcomes. Now, as I said, the causal arrow here, works both ways, and we're not trying to claim that gerrymandering directly causes infant mortality. But if we can go to the next slide, we can look at policy, and we can look at the policy decisions that those legislatures made. And these are just a few examples that we cite in the book. After 2011, we can look at the response to state legislatures to the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. We can look at other extreme health policy legislation like the recent, and now, of course, with Texas not wanting to be behind anyone else, really extreme abortion policies and bans, so-called heartbeat abortion bans. And what we see when we look at the legislatures along these dimensions is a very clear pattern in that extremely gerrymandered state legislatures were far more likely to either file lawsuits against the federal government regarding the compliance with the Affordable Care Act, or to delay implementation or otherwise try to obstruct the process of implementing what is probably the most important healthcare policy to pass in the United States in generations. And similarly, when we look at these heartbeat abortion bans in particular, soon after these legislatures took over, after 2011, we saw states like Alabama, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Oklahoma. They were among the first states to start passing these bans that most of them were 20 to 14 week bans on abortion, intentionally challenging Roe v. Wade and national abortion policy. And as we know, over the last few years, there have been even more states that have passed these laws. And one of the key things that I think that this chart demonstrates is one might be pressed to argue that this is just partisanship, right? This is just Republicans versus Democrats. But indeed, what our analysis shows and what some of the other models that we've run show is that it's the size of the coalition that matters. And this is why gerrymandering matters. It's not simply which party controls the legislature, it's the size of the coalition and how many seats they control, because that determines the extent to which special interest within those groups can advance a more extreme agenda. And we're demonstrating that pretty clearly with these and a couple of other charts. Alex, if you could show the next slide. Again, the response to COVID really did provide us an opportunity to look at how these state legislatures responded. And once again, if we look at the actual response, this is the budgetary and health and public policy response on the part of state legislatures, including mandates and vaccine output and the like. Again, we see a pretty clear pattern that overall the response to COVID was much lower on a scale of responsiveness compared to states that were either under Democratic or divided control. And there's a difference between, again, simple GOP control of the legislature and extremely gerrymandered legislatures. They were among the worst responders to COVID. This also, of course, has political consequences. And if we look at the last slide I have to show, we looked at the electoral response to COVID among the state legislatures. And as you might imagine, Democratic-controlled legislatures were much quicker to ease the burden on voters. That is, to expand vote by mail, to ease the process of applying for an absentee ballot. And in many cases, in California, where I'm at, for example, the state decided to move to a universal vote by mail model and send out ballots to every active registered voter. And again, you can see that there isn't much difference among expanding vote by mail options, which includes reducing witness requirements, as some states did, or making the process less burdensome. But overall, again, when we look at things like moving to universal vote by mail, the pattern's very clear that there were no states that were extreme gerrymanders that decided to move to a universal vote by mail model, which really minimizes the cost of voting in a pandemic and is much more attuned to the public health needs of the voter. The final chart I have is a sort of overview of this, and we look at the change in the cost of voting overall. And in this context, you can see, again, when we're looking at who controls the legislatures, the cost of voting is a measure that looks at the overall burden on the voter. So this looks at registration requirements, it looks at ballot access, access to early voting, both in-person and absentee voting, and the like. And we can see that the more biased the state legislature is across the board, we don't really, the Democratic controlled legislatures are pretty noisy in this regard, as Alex showed earlier, but a very clear pattern emerges, especially among Republican controlled legislatures. And the most biased legislatures up there in the upper left quadrant, right, those are the states that overall actually made it more difficult to vote or didn't ease the burden on voting relative to all 50 states. And so we have some pretty clear policy patterns here in terms of the consequences of gerrymandering, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of the life and death decisions that many state legislatures had to make in response to the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. And, as Michael said, parties are going to party, but it's really striking to see the difference between GOP controlled legislatures and GOP extremely gerrymandered legislatures. And you touched on this, but can one of you or several of you talk a little more about how gerrymandering can lead to more extreme policies than would otherwise be passed?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, as can all of us, I think. But one of the problems is you get somebody whose only constituency that they care about are the people that vote in the primary. That if they survive the primary, they're in the office because of the gerrymandering. I'll use it as an example, Madison Cawthorn. This guy, he's already got 4 challengers in his primary. And one of the challengers put it pretty succinctly, saying, politics is about policy and performance. And he's got the performance part down, but he hasn't done anything on policy. He's so busy out there trying to get people cranked up that he doesn't even vote. He's not engaged in the policy dimension. But of course, the problem is there's always an incumbent advantage. If the cost of voting are high, only the people who are really enthusiastic are going to go vote in the primary. And then the result is you get somebody whose primary thing to do is to get an agitated sector of the population to support them. So if you can run grievance politics as really your only platform, then you are going to be reelected as long as the primary makes it difficult enough for people that are not that upset to go vote. So you get bad policy outcomes when you don't have competitive elections because people are running on the wrong things. In California, we just had a recall election, and it's very hard to figure out what Larry Elder was running on. His platform was he was angry that Gavin Newsom ate dinner somewhere. John Cox, another Republican who did very poorly, was angry that Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor, was attractive. If you don't have a platform, he literally complained about how good looking Gavin Newsom is. So I'm not exaggerating. It's literally one of his ads. So if you don't have a platform about policy, but you can still motivate voters to show up in a primary and win a gerrymandered district because of it, because they're angry at the other side. Owning liberals is the only thing Madison Cawthorn has to be good at, making his voters feel he's upset some nameless, faceless liberals somewhere in New York, as if they care what some rural North Carolina rep thinks. But so you get a pernicious policy outcome when making good policy isn't the metric by which voters decide whether you keep your job or not. Then I'll turn it over to anybody else that also wants to add in on that.
To be fair, sometimes I get upset at how handsome Gavin Newsom is as well.
We all do, but it doesn't mean he should lose his job.
I'll just add on one thing to that, which is that if you think about how you actually achieve gerrymandering in the South, for example, as my earlier presentation showed, you target communities of color and you more or less rope large majorities of African American, Latino voters into a small number of districts. How does that affect the faces of your colleagues in the state legislature? Instead of having, 20 majority Black districts, suddenly you have like 12 or 11. And how large is the legislative Black caucus of your state when you have this racial gerrymandering going on? And, regardless of what you think and what you see on TV, legislatures talk to each other. Legislatures try to be collegial and friendly, aside from what's going on the floor. And when you only have, 10% of the state legislatures who are African American or Latino or representing majority minority districts, that affects your interactions with your colleagues and how you interact. And it undermines the ability of minority communities to advocate for certain issues that matter to them and to share their perspectives with their colleagues.
Sorry, Michael, did you have a comment on that?
There are two important points that I think that Alex raises that expand beyond just majority and minority communities. The design of electoral districts also shapes the capacity for multiracial coalitions to exist and the capacity for multiracial coalitions to bargain and compromise and advance their community's interest in legislatures. So it really does shape in a fundamental way the whole context of legislative decision making. And our research suggests that it really is no surprise at all that the communities that suffer the most in the United States in terms of poor health policy, poor environmental policy, the communities that are targeted to suffer the burdens of environmental injustice are the same communities that are targeted for both gerrymandering and restrictive election laws.
And let me just tag in on that. So in a real sense, gerrymandering on one side of the equation is about capturing political power, but you can't capture more political power than you earn from the population without depriving someone else of political power. So elites and their constituents that run these gerrymanders gain political power, but it is directly at the expense of, in most cases, communities of color and other folks who are disadvantaged in a variety of other ways. So there is a zero sum in how many seats are in the legislature, how many seats are in the House. And if I improperly take a seat from you, you are harmed. There's a direct policy and principled harm to these communities.
And it can be even worse in some situations. Those who actually are Democrats who receive seats in a gerrymander then have an interest in actually maintaining the same structure. So you've not only sort of advantaged yourself and you've shut a lot of people out, but you've actually also, to some degree, bought off the opposition. You have like a controlled, an opposition that at least on one dimension has an incentive on keeping things the same. So,
yeah, this is one of the interesting things as well that we've seen in our research is that I saw, there'll be a time for answering questions. So somebody said, why is it so difficult to get nonpartisan districting? Well, a lot of times you see the majority party co-opting members of the minority by drawing safe seats. And if I'm a member of my minority party, I know that the majority has the power to draw the districts however they want. And, maybe I had a close election last time. If they can give me a little bit of extra space, then, for my political career, that's an incentive for me to go along with the gerrymander. And it happened across the Midwest. You saw Republicans being able to get a few Democrats, if they needed that super majority veto proof approval of the gerrymander, in a couple of cases, they were able to co-opt a Democrat here and there.
But so you have these cases where people or political parties are capturing more political power than they've earned, or trying to hang on to the power that they have from the previous way the districts were drawn. And you have them possibly voting for policies that wouldn't be chosen with majority approval, but that are extreme, that appeal to certain groups and subsets. Why isn't this self-correcting? If you're passing policies that aren't popular with people, the logic goes that shouldn't you be voted out of office? If you're drawing districts in a way that's benefiting just you, shouldn't voters respond to that?
But you've drawn the districts.
Yeah.
So you draw the districts, you choose your voters, they elect you, then you draw the districts again and you choose your voters. And, it's unfortunately self-perpetuating because, it's worse at the state level than the federal level, because at the state level, literally the people who are drawing the districts are those who are being elected. People are literally drawing their own districts. So it becomes very difficult to actually find a way to challenge it, other than sometimes by judicial review. Judicial review has been very important. The reason we have, of course, a Democratic majority in the House now is that people did, in the last cycle, challenge districts in various states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina, and the districts that were switched account for more than the actual current Democratic majority. So that can make a difference, but it's really difficult, especially I think at the state level.
And then compounding that, not only is it a moving target because the politicians who have chosen their own voters, rather than letting the voters choose the politicians, get to decide the rules of the game the next time around, but also getting voters who are worried about paying their bills, getting their kid to soccer practice, making sure the orthodontist appointment isn't missed, all these other things that go on in people's lives. We pay a lot more attention to politics than most people. And so when it comes time to run an election, if what you can do is talk about your opponent hates America and wants to walk on a flag and all of these sort of symbolic things that don't have anything to do with substance or policy, you can make the election about things that don't matter, but resonate emotionally with voters so they don't realize they're doing badly. Bear in mind, roughly 30% of the country has been convinced COVID is not a big deal by their political elites, even though now I read today, 1 in 500 Americans have died from COVID. Basically, we have 9/11 every 4 or 5 days. And, we always forget. It's an amazing turnaround, and it's being driven by the elite-led mobilization of their voters that think they agree with them on a host of issues, but it clouds up issues. So you can't go in and talk about infant mortality rate because it's complicated. You can't talk about, your representative challenged the American Care Act and you're worse off. The voters that put that person in office are going to say, no, I hate Obamacare. I didn't like Obama. I don't want to be a socialist, or whatever fluff you can stir up. So it's difficult to penetrate substantively in elections when you can have exciting things that don't really matter from a policy standpoint.
Right, and one of the reasons that there's this reliance on these rage-inducing talking points among politicians is, as you said, it's hard for it to get people to come out to vote. And as Michael showed in one of his slides, the cost of voting is extremely high for some people more than others. So can we talk a bit more about that, like the impact that gerrymandering has on voting rights and on democracy as a whole?
Certainly, the part of the challenge that we face this year, moving into the 2022 election, as that last chart showed, is that, as Tony just said, once a legislature is in control, then they write the next rules, right? They write the rules for the next election. And so what we're seeing across state legislatures is reductions in ease of registration, eligibility requirements, the elimination of pre-registration where it once existed, the reduction of opportunities to vote early, and voter ID requirements. And none of these things may make a specific or even measurable interest impact on its own. But if you look at the cumulative effect of these election rules and access to the ballot, they make maybe a 2 or 3% difference. But in a number of states where the electoral college is decided by much fewer than 2 or 3% of the vote share, that can be decisive.
Yeah, I mean, going back to sort of Lotta's earlier point, actually, I think it is. I mean, at some point, maybe it is self-correcting. Eventually, if you get enough voters to sort of like change their mind, eventually, this will overcome any level of gerrymandering. The problem is, that'll take some time, and the gerrymandering and the various other things that Mike is talking about in terms of really sort of slows this process down, makes it take much longer. I think a lot of gerrymanders that we're looking at, whether you're looking at Georgia or Texas, they're really defensive gerrymanders, and there's a recognition that the state is changing and is going to change politically, but the gerrymander has been drawn in a specific way to make sure that change takes as long as possible. I think in Georgia, for example, if the Democrats were to win 8% more votes in the East and at the congressional level, it probably wouldn't make a difference. It may begin to change the result, but it would have to be that sort of degree of swing. So it's a defensive mechanism. So, but yeah, we must not be too sort of pessimistic. If we can mobilize enough people, yeah, that will make obviously will make a difference.
And it's another interesting thing that Tony just brought up. The time horizon for those of us that think about things like democracy and the preservation of the country and all of this sort of thing, we care about the country in perpetuity. For many of the politicians, they care about the country for their foreseeable career trajectory. So does Lindsey Graham care about the filibuster? Not really. Does he care about being reelected at least one more time? Yes, 100%. Do state legislatures care if voters get disenfranchised? Not in the least. It doesn't bother them in the least as long as they get reelected. So we have this disconnect between the politicians who are setting these rules and the principles under which they ought to be operating to set these rules. But this is not a new phenomenon. If you read Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, we start out with this idea. These are the short newspaper sort of pamphlets that were written to persuade people to support the Constitution. We start out with, gee, a really big country is going to be enough, and there'll be so many people, everything's going to go great, that ambition will be set against ambition, and these bad actors, these people that we expect to not be that great, that want to be politicians, they're not going to be able to control everything. And then we get to 51, and the sales pitch is, yeah, but we also have these institutions that are set up to protect us against the bad actors that want to be politicians. So I often will say, the dog drinks out of the toilet. I wish he wouldn't, but he does, and I know he does. Politicians care primarily about being reelected for virtually every reason you can think of. It doesn't make them bad, it's just the nature of the beast. So what we have to do is set up institutions and have enough democratic people-level participation that you can overcome the lesser instincts of the political animal. I can close the lid on the toilet. I guess is a way to think about it.
Thank you for that excellent metaphor. And that actually takes me right to the hardest question of all. We've gone through to some pretty depressing places right now, but what do we do about all of this? And this question I'm directing at Sophia because as an organizer, as well as a scientist, you are stuck with this one.
I was just going to comment about that. As a scientist who turned community organizer, because I realized our elected representatives care more about how many people we can mobilize to pressure them to do the right thing instead of listening to people like me with expert advice who have PhD credentials. That's why I ended up switching courses in what I do, because as someone who the whole reason I got my PhD in immunology and microbiology and bachelor's in chemistry was because I came from a community that was used as a dumping ground for the oil industry. And seeing how, when I intentionally went to do my research at research PhD training at NIH. And I was and intentionally went there so that I could also access Capitol Hill. And I realized these people don't care anything about whether or not I have these credentials and all this expertise to tell them to do the right thing. They want to see how many people I can mobilize to get them and get it, to pressure them so that they can get reelected, because that is what it translates into their mind. That's the currency that translates into their mind. So, definitely what I would like to let people know is that you and I are in a critical moment now with this redistricting cycle. People like you and me outnumber the special interest groups who want to dissipate coalition power of people like you and me. You have a fundamental role to play in upholding the integrity of fair representation so that you, your family members, your friends, and your community members are fairly represented in elections. Fair mapping assures that you are fairly represented as constituents. Gerrymandering, as has been pointed out by several of our scholars here, has real life impacts as anti-science representatives are using platforms to spread COVID-19 denial, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, racism, sexism, xenophobia, ableism, anti-Semitism, and or anti-LGBTQ plus hatred. We're seeing, especially in the past couple of weeks now, we've got abortion with Texas being a problem for that is endangering whether or not women or people with uteruses have basically the ability to get an abortion and have bodily autonomy. As a disabled Indigenous femme two-spirit scientist who's been a member of Jewish communities, I see the harmful impacts that gerrymandering has had on communities of my identities, especially here in Arizona. Arizona has been the nation's hotspot for online searches about violent extremism and conspiracy theories after being the hotspot for COVID-19 in the world twice. We're on our way to being the COVID hotspot a third time, I strongly predict. Several anti-science elected representatives in Arizona have been implicated in planning the insurrection, while Arizona is still an ongoing high target for constant voter suppression. So the COVID-19 pandemic has shown more than ever that what happens to someone you have never met in another part of the world can impact you, even in potentially harmful ways, fatal ways, because the federal government of the USA relies on the representation of constituents all across the USA, and the federal representation eventually impacts all of us, none of us is safe from these disturbed influences using unfair practices in our representation system until all of us is safe. So the most consistent tactic that works to get people in power to do the right thing is for people like you and me working in solidarity together to assert the solutions that people like you and me need. Take a moment right now and enter into the chat about what the threat of gerrymandering means to what the threat of gerrymandering means to you or how it matters to you. Can you do that right now in the chat? and I'm not saying a whole lot, but all right. So now I want to wrap up our time together with a few quick ways. Oh, we're getting some people. Yeah, so want to wrap up our time together with a few quick ways you can do something right now. Some opportunities and resources to get, I'll put some opportunities and resources for you to get involved in your local redistricting processes. First, I would like you to sign this letter to encourage the census, encourage fair redistricting with the Census Bureau. Additionally, I'm going to share some tools and resources for you to help gerrymandering, so a link with that. And then don't worry, I will have a compiled version if it's catching with everyone else's information coming through. This link provides hands-on steps to use your skills to tackle gerrymandering as well, and it also includes excellent resources such as state-by-state timelines of redistricting activities generated by Common Cause in Charge, our coalition focused on assuring fair and science-based redistricting. You'll get a suite of gerrymandering report cards and mapping tools from Princeton Gerrymandering Project along with Represent Us. In fact, we have teamed up with Charge to cultivate a team of scientists who are willing to assist in map making and reviews. So no matter what state you're tuning in from, there are tools here for you in that link that I provided. And if you're from the specific states of Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, or Wisconsin, or you know of peers in those areas who may be interested, we'll be following up with more specific engagement opportunities to support local Democratic group-led efforts. In public hearings, public awareness building through local media and support in map making and assessments. You'll be hearing from us with those links and opportunities, but what would be really helpful for us is letting us know what your capacity is to get involved. So I'm dropping a link in the chat as well, where I'd like you to fill that out to let us know what your capacity is. And then definitely if you have any questions, I'm also dropping that in the chat as well, that you can shoot me an email. And I can definitely answer any questions you may have about how you can get involved and assuring that you are fairly represented in the redistricting processes.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for sharing those calls to action and also reminding us that it's not hopeless and that great things can happen when we work in solidarity. The fight is not lost. But now we have a bit of time for questions. You can drop something in the Q&A. I believe there are also some questions in the chat, which I'll check out in a second. But for the moment, I'm looking at the Q&A open questions. Mark Sanders asks, what success have we seen with nonpartisan commissions avoiding partisan gerrymandering? Isn't it a mixed bag? Why do we think there hasn't been more? Sorry, go ahead.
Alex, why don't you take that one?
So the question is, have we seen success with nonpartisan commissions avoiding partisan gerrymandering? The short answer is yes. There aren't a lot of nonpartisan commissions. One of the advantages at looking at the state legislative maps is that there's a lot more. And when we make a complicated statistical model to tease out the precise effects of using a nonpartisan commission, what we see is a very significant drop-off in the level of bias. So moving away from political gerrymandering will lead to a reduction, I can't remember what we find in the book, of like 7% or something like that in bias. And establishing a nonpartisan commission or having an independent non-political actor draw the maps will give you an additional 7%. So, I mean, this is like a measurable change in the level of bias. The problem is when you look at courts and commissions, they don't like radical change. And so they're likely to deviate from the status quo to achieve a neutral map, but that change doesn't come overnight. It can take several redistricting cycles. And if you can think about the perspective of a judge, for example, If you have a map that's extremely gerrymandered that gives one party a huge advantage, the judge might roll some of that bias back, but you're not going to have radical change overnight. And so I've been observing a hybrid commission model here in Virginia that's made up partially of legislatures and partially of citizens. And I've been actually surprised at the lengths that they have gone to avoid political favoritism. One of the first things they did was they voted to completely start from scratch, which is not something that I've ever seen. So they basically tore the current maps up and started from the ground up. That creates a whole host of other problems. Given the nature of Virginia's reforms, the General Assembly has to approve those maps, which probably would never do since it pits incumbents against each other. But the point of the matter is that our evidence suggests that when regular people who don't have personal ties to politics or politicians are drawing the maps, they do pretty well, and you see a net improvement.
Thank you. And I think we touched upon this, but I wanted to see if there were other responses to this question. Why is finding a nonpartisan committee to draw the lines in Georgia such an issue? Is it solely due to one party wanting to control the political landscape in Georgia, or is it more complicated than that?
I don't think it's more complicated than that. This is in Georgia. This is, just an outstanding textbook example of trying to legislate yourself into power permanently. It's everything from stripping away voter rolls to this crazy power grab of taking over the Fulton County elections process. And so the reason they don't want it on one side of the aisle is because it will result in fair elections, and they don't want that. I mean, that's the bottom line, in my view, anyway.
Another question, sort of touching on commissions. Has there been a study of how to be most effective at establishing redistricting commissions in states without a citizen ballot initiative?
That's a great point. And what we have seen and what our study makes clear is that in many of the states that are most in need of reform, the initiative process is not available, right? Georgia being one of those examples. And Virginia is really the only example of the legislative process actually yielding a productive process for establishing a commission. It's quite difficult. There are some state legislatures and some state constitutions have free and fair elections clauses, which then provides a means of litigating a more fair process. But ultimately, it really does come down to people in the state. You've got to organize and mobilize in order to generate a process, and that's true not just at the state level, but federally. I saw that Michael McDonald, an old friend and colleague, had a question about federal legislation and about HR 1 and federal requirements being really the only hope, especially for these very entrenched legislatures that don't have an initiative process. And that is very true. I don't know if many of you have had a chance to look at this compromise bill that Senator Joe Manchin just introduced, and the Democrats are going to be pushing, the Democratic leadership in Congress, I should say. And it actually, I was kind of surprised to see that it does away with the commission requirement that HR 1, the For the People Act, has. But I think it's fascinating to see that they have actually built in a number of what we at least would consider procedural justice processes into the process. So this bill would allow state legislatures to still run the show, but it sets up very strict requirements about the procedures used to determine what's a fair map and not a fair map. Procedures that I think we would all agree with, and that certainly, if we were asked, we probably would have suggested anyways. Very clear procedures on and restrictions on states if a lawsuit is brought that put a hold on the maps and basically give the benefit of the doubt to those challenging the claim rather than giving the states. What is often the case is that even if states know they're going to litigate a map, if a state legislature knows it's going to get sued, it will come up with a really extreme map and then kind of back off a little bit through the the litigation process because they know they get another bite at the apple, so to speak. But this federal law would actually change that process considerably. So the federal legislation would be transformative. At the end of the day, though, I think we all know that none of that federal legislation is going to pass without tremendous public support and pressure on the Democratic leadership and on Congress to do something.
And I'll just add to this, one of the drawbacks of HR 1, well, it's politically dead, clearly, but one of the drawbacks, even though it's nice to say that all the states should use commissions, and it has an explicit ban on partisan gerrymandering, which would let the courts, federal courts, weigh in. The drawback is that this doesn't apply to states drawing their own boundaries.
That's right.
And as we argue in the book, this is arguably a bigger problem than and more problematic for democracy than states rigging their congressional maps. And so these are legislatures drawing their own lines. And so it's hard to imagine Congress being able to say, Alabama, you have to use a commission to draw your own state legislative lines. It's not clear that Congress has that authority. So maybe, it would be very helpful for Congress, but it's not clear that it would necessarily help everything. So I second Mike and Sophia that the only way we're going to stop this is collective action and mobilization. And our book is essentially a case study of the only instance in which a legislature voluntarily gave up its power to establish a commission. It's a hybrid model, granted, but that's the only time it's ever happened. And our book goes into some detail about how that happened and the conditions on the ground that resulted. And what happens is it's essentially this mobilization, grassroots organization, a little bit of money from some wealthy benefactors, sort of culminating in this multi-year campaign to pressure the legislature right as the Republicans were poised to lose power. And that's sort of this magic coming together of all of these factors.
So Alex makes a really important point. You get this in Virginia because the Republicans who were in power saw their imminent doom on the time horizon. And they decided they would be better off with an independent commission than with the Democrats being able to do to them what they had been doing to the Democrats forever. So the how often that will align is who knows. But we can outvote virtually any prohibition or institutional structure that's designed to harm democratic representation. So if every single person that does vote would bring 10 more people to the polls, you would have different outcomes routinely in lots and lots of places. Obviously not everywhere, but in lots and lots of places. So mobilization and organization is ultimately the organic cure to all of these institutional problems. And, frankly, you're not going to get any real relief from the Supreme Court anymore. I don't know if anybody saw this, Amy Coney Barrett at the Mitch McConnell Center speaking to a Mitch McConnell fundraiser group with Mitch McConnell by her side, talking about how inappropriate it was. People thought Supreme Court justices were partisan hacks. I don't know if I mentioned she was at the Mitch McConnell Center at the time, but you're not going to get any relief from the Supreme Court anytime soon. Those hopes passed into the night with RBG, and John Roberts may be in the permanent minority, screaming about incrementalism and all these other sorts of things and constitutional rights. But right now, there's a ruling coalition on the Supreme Court that's going to not provide relief in any of these dimensions. So what's left is the people. What's left are voters. What's left are people who can pick up the phone and ask their friends and relatives to go with them to a poll, and then ask those people, call up your friends and relatives and bring them along too.
No, thank you so much. That's I think that's the perfect note to take away from all this, because there is a question asking if litigation is the solution. But I think that we've heard from all of you that it has its drawbacks, it has its limitations. It might be at least in not the Supreme Court, but in the lower courts, it might be one part of the solution. HR1 or S1 now might be another part. But mobilization and grassroots activism, collective action like that, that's a key component as well. And with that, thank you all so much for your time. I'm going to turn it back to Janine to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you, Lada, for moderating such a wonderful panel. And thank you so much to our panelists for such informative, a little heavy, but hopeful, a hopeful discussion. And I want people to really understand that you can listen to all of this and, feel down, but just like Sophia said, just like Tony said, and other panelists said, there are things that we can do. And so if you want, first, I have a few things before we close out. If you've listened to this and you're like, man, this is amazing, I want to learn more. Guess what? They wrote a book. And if you want to read Gerrymandering the States to learn more, I'm going to put a discount code in the chat, and you can go and get 20% off of this fantastic book. And so that is the first thing. The second thing I want to tell you is if you feel charged up, see charge? I did it, Kathy. I see you on there. If you feel charged up and you want to learn more about how you and your community can get involved to help ensure the drawing of fair maps, to make sure that the people draw the maps, to make sure that the people choose their elected officials and not the other way around, I want to invite you to sign up for the Charge newsletter. And so I'll put the instructions in there. It's got state-specific information, all the events and webinars and trainings that Charge is doing. And so I encourage everyone to sign up for the newsletter. And lastly, as a part of our Charge training series, Charge will be hosting tonight a redistricting college training that you can go online and actually see recordings of this training to see how your community and your organizations can get involved in the redistricting process in your state. But tonight will be the first time that the Redistricting Community College will be done in Spanish. And so I want to invite all of our Spanish speakers to go to this and to share it with your friends and family and relatives, everybody, so that we can be there tonight and I just put it in the chat. So tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern time, we will have the Redistricting Community College in Spanish. Again, thank you so much to our moderator. Thank you to our host. Thank you to our panelists, all of you. And thank you for all of you that joined us today. And remember that at the end of the day, we draw the maps. And to be able to draw those maps, we have to be engaged in this process. And so I'm going to end it there. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.